courage. Don't leave me.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the infamous Castlevania on the Nintendo 64, which is also commonly referred to as Castlevania 64, even though the actual title of the game is just simply Castlevania. The game was released in 1999 by Konami, and was the first entry in the series to make the risky leap to full-on 3D gameplay. It's 1852, and Dracula has reawakened from his ancient slumber. It's now up to our two heroes, Reinhard Schneider, heir to the Belmont legacy of vampire hunters, and Carrie Fernandez, a young orphan who wields the power of magic, to put him away for good. It won't be an easy task though, since they'll have to deal with Dracula's countless minions, as well as hordes of the undead, in order to finally take care of the Count once and for all. The game's position in the official chronology of the series is kinda confusing. While it was originally a part of the timeline within the initial window of its release, it was omitted entirely later on. At this point in time, it is officially part of the chronology of the franchise, but in a very vague sense. Not much is known about how or where it fits in. Castlevania on the Nintendo 64 is majorly different than any game in the series up to this point, since it is the first game in the franchise to take place in a completely three-dimensional environment. With this change, a lot of other things change with it. The combat itself is no longer a linear affair, and Reinhardt can whip in any direction around him. You'll be attacked from all angles and have to keep your wits about you in order to make it safely to the final battle with the Count. As with most of the other games in the series, you still have special weapons that can be picked up and used, though really the only one that matters in this iteration is the cross. Once you pick up the cross, hold on to it for the rest of the game. It's like running with the spread shot in Contra from beginning to end. It just makes life much easier. Gone are the hearts that were exclusively used in the past as ammunition for your special weapons. This time, red jewels take on that role and can be picked up as either large or small gems, which add different amounts to your running total. You'll also notice that in addition to the whip and special weapon, each character now has a close-range melee attack. Reinhardt can pull out and slash with a short sword, though it's really only useful when searching for items or killing small enemies like bats. It's just not nearly as powerful as the whip. Speaking of the whip, it can be made stronger in a similar fashion to the older games by snagging power-ups that are often dropped by enemies or hidden in candles throughout the game. The whip itself can be powered up a total of 3 times before being maxed out, and once it is, you won't be able to pick up any further power-up items. The only bummer about this is that if you save the game and reload later, you'll be at base strength and have to power up the whip again, which does kinda suck. Carrie uses a fireball to attack, and it can be upgraded the same way. The thing is, her fireball tracks enemies, so playing through the game with her is actually much easier than with Reinhardt. The only real difference is that she has a different underground level than he does, and some varying NPC encounters and dialogue. You'll also be collecting gold throughout the game that can be used at various points to buy items from the game's shopkeeper, Raynon, who can be accessed by using one of the several contracts that you'll find laying around. Also now on the HUD display is a status notification, which for the most part will read good until you end up getting bit by a vampire or poisoned. When that happens, you'll need to use an item to bring your status back to good standing. One of my favorite features in Castlevania for the 64 is the inventory system. No longer will you have to use that item the second you find it. You can stock up to 10 of most any item and use it when necessary, so saving those health items for the next inevitable boss fight makes all kinds of sense. The game itself is broken up into stages, although it can be a bit confusing since most of them are huge. Castlevania is one of those titles that's not easily accessible. It requires a fair amount of time to learn your way around most of the massive levels. There are quite a few instances of finding keys or triggering events that you would never know to do unless you got really into it and learned each stage like the back of your hand. It's not as ridiculous as Simon's Quest, but it still requires a fair amount of dedication. There's also a fair amount of puzzle solving to be done on your way to Dracula's castle, but none of it is overly difficult and won't take up too much of your time. Most of it involves flipping switches, lining things up, or using your sun and moon cards in order to move on to the next section. See, there's a clock system in Castlevania on the Nintendo 64, and the time of day changes regularly. Throughout your adventure, you'll pick up sun and moon cards, which can be used to change the time of day on the fly. There are a fair amount of doors in the game that can only be opened during the day or at night, and a few cutscene events that can also only be triggered by certain times of the day. It's an interesting dynamic that definitely adds to the platforming gameplay. Castlevania looks really good on the Nintendo 64, although it doesn't age as well as a lot of the 2D iterations, since 3D gaming was still in that awkward transitional period in the late 90s. Still, the game looks great and the character design is top-notch. The stages and environments are excellent, and all have a kind of desolate and dark feeling to them that really contribute to its atmosphere, and the bosses are huge and intimidating. There is a bit of slowdown when things get a little chaotic, but it doesn't detract from the overall experience. There are also some pretty neat cutscenes here and there that help to move the plot along, and they're all done very well. My favorite one is about halfway through the game when one of the characters, Rosa, tries to commit suicide by stepping in the sunlight, which was pretty shocking for a game at the time. Like most Castlevania games, the sound and music in this one is fantastic. Oddly enough, the Nintendo 64 version rarely gets mentioned for its soundtrack, which to me is crazy. Castlevania 64 has easily one of the darkest, original, and best soundtracks of any game in the expansive series. The music is all very haunting and subtle, and does a tremendous job of complementing the huge stages and boss encounters. The sound effects are equally good. The whip cracks and explosions sound great, as do the various growls and grunts of the enemies throughout the game. Back before Castlevania was released, it was hard to imagine playing it on a Nintendo 64 controller. Thankfully, the control scheme works pretty well. A is used to jump, and B is used to dish out your primary attack, and the Z button can be used to execute a very useful slide maneuver. In addition, the C buttons all have their own uses as well. C down is used to toss your special weapon, left is your melee attack, and right is your action button that can be used to flip switches or open doors. The top C button is used to change the default camera angle, and the R button can be pressed to center the camera on your character, which you'll end up using quite a bit. It all feels pretty smooth, and once you get the hang of it, you'll be platforming and stomping out enemies with ease. Castlevania on the Nintendo 64 gets a lot of crap, and it's undeserved. It's one of those games that became cool to hate for some reason. The funny thing is, if you look up a lot of critic reviews from the time period, it did really well. I blame a lot of the unjustified complaining on a younger generation of overly critical gamers that never honestly played it, or were too young at the time to remember and properly appreciate what it brought to the table. A lot of people cite Castlevania's so-called tedious moments and backtracking as prime reasoning as to why it's such a horrible game. There's nothing about Castlevania on the 64 that's horrible. It's a great game and an excellent addition to the series. You know what else is tedious? Playing through the whole game and then having to play through the entire castle again upside down. I'm looking at you, Symphony of the Night. My point is, many games in the series, even the revered ones, have tedious moments in them. Give the 64 version a break. One positive that's come from its idiotic criticism is that the game is extremely affordable now. You can pick up a copy for under $10 with little to no effort. There was a second game released on the 64 entitled Legacy of Darkness that's essentially just an updated version of the original with extra characters and plot lines. It's a lot more expensive, but it is also worth playing if you enjoy the original. Castlevania on the 64 is not the best game of the series, but it's a damn good one. I reserve those spots exclusively for Dracula X on the PC Engine or Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis. It's easily up there in the top 5 though, and deserves to be played, enjoyed, and appreciated. As always guys, I'd like to thank you all for watching and subscribing, and until next time, stay classic.